In nearly 20 years, Vincent Kompany has lived in a state that few could understand, where every run on the pitch was not just a sporting action, but an effort against his own body and the invisible limits closing in on him, where he learned to stand tall even when everything inside was cracking, where silence became the only protective shell against doubts, pains, and fears that were never allowed to show. He had no privilege to be weak, no space to collapse, because to the world he was not just a player, but a pillar, the one who kept balance for the entire collective. And that forced him to accept a double life. One man stepping into the light with absolute certainty, and one man retreating into the shadows to face unanswered questions, times when his body betrayed him, long nights when he was not sure if he could continue the next day. He chose not to speak out, not to explain, not to seek pity, but only to keep going, day by day, match by match, each return after injury as if nothing had happened. And precisely in that silence, his willpower was not just ordinary resilience, but a form of strength forged from having to exist under constant pressure without being allowed to fall. And then, that very man created one of the greatest careers in the history of Manchester City, as captain leading the club to 4 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, 4 League Cups, along with countless other domestic honors, becoming the symbol of an unprecedented era of success, while being named in the Premier League Team of the Season multiple times and twice voted Manchester City Player of the Year, leaving his mark with decisive moments, such as the winning goal against Leicester City in 2019, which not only helped the team move closer to the title but also etched his name into the history of the league. At the international level, he was captain of the Belgium national team during what was considered its golden generation, helping the team secure 3rd place at the World Cup 2018, the highest achievement in Belgian football history, and after leaving the pitch, he continued to prove his value on the coaching bench by leading Burnley FC says to the championship title with convincing play, opening a new chapter in his career at FC Bayern Munich, where he continues his journey building his legacy not only through titles, but by leading and inspiring. Before continuing this journey, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to support the story of a man who has silently endured far more than the world has ever seen. And in the next part, we will return to where it all began, the childhood of Vincent Kompany, where he learned to be silent before he learned to stand firm. The childhood of Vincent Kompany did not begin with cheers or carefree afternoons on the grass, but with a nameless, quiet feeling in the streets of Brussels, where he grew up in an immigrant family carrying both hopes and invisible distances from the surrounding world. His father, Pierre Kompany, was a man from Congo who carried dignity and the desire to build a better life for his children, while his mother, a Belgian woman, was the rare gentleness in a house that always had to fight harsh realities. But that gentleness did not last long enough, because when Vincent was still very young, he had to face the first loss of his life when his mother left and created a void that could not be filled. A silent but lingering void that stretched through the years, making a child who had not yet fully understood the world learn to accept absence as part of life. From that point, the house was no longer a place of laughter, but became a place of silence, where each person withdrew into themselves to survive. And Vincent, in his immaturity, had no choice but to grow up earlier than all the other children, learning not to ask questions that no one could answer, learning not to cry when there was no one to comfort him, learning to stand up without needing a helping hand. His father became the only pillar, a man who had to be both father and fill the gap left by the lost mother, while also fighting the outside society where his origins made life never truly easy. Pierre was not someone who talked much about emotions. He taught his son through actions, through discipline, through expectations so high that sometimes Vincent did not know if he could ever reach them. But precisely in that strictness, something was formed, not warmth, but endurance, not comfort, but the ability to continue even when he did not want to. Vincent grew up between two worlds, one of African roots from his father and one European world where he lived but never fully belonged to either, and that feeling of being lost was not always spoken. It existed in glances, in casual words, sharp enough to leave cuts, in moments when he realized he was different, not by choice but by origin. There were days he came home carrying unanswerable questions, unexplainable hurts, and instead of expressing them, he chose silence. Because silence was the only way to keep everything from breaking further. Precisely in that environment, Vincent did not learn to express emotions like other children. He had no space to be weak, no chance to be protected, and gradually, suppression became instinct, became his way of existing. A habit no one taught but sank so deep that he no longer noticed it. He learned to stand alone, to make decisions himself, to take responsibility himself, to face fears without anyone knowing, and over time that self-reliance became inseparable, not as a choice but as something mandatory. While other children were still learning to play, Vincent was learning to endure. While others sought recognition, he learned not to need it, and when life began to demand more, he was ready in a way he himself did not fully understand, because from very early on, he had become used to carrying things too heavy for a child, and that very silence, that early maturity, laid the foundation for the man the world later saw. A man who could stand firm under any pressure, but also a man accustomed to hiding everything he was enduring long before anyone noticed. When the years of childhood had not yet closed in the normal way, Vincent Kompany stepped into a world where everything happened faster, harsher, and with no room for the slowness of a child. When he joined RSC, Anderlecht from a very young age, bringing not only talent, but also everything he had accumulated from silence, from voids, from an incomplete childhood. Right from the first days, people saw something different in him. Not just physical, not just technique, but the way he carried himself on the pitch. A calmness unlike his age, and gaze that did not seek recognition but only focused on not being allowed to make mistakes, and that precisely made him stand out quickly, becoming the hope not only of a team, but also of his family, of the community, of those who saw in him a path they had never had the chance to take. But along with that prominence came an invisible pressure, the pressure to always be right, to always be better, to always move forward. Because Vincent was no longer a boy playing ball for joy, but someone carrying the expectations of many people. And that changed the way he saw himself from very early on. While children of the same age were still living carefree days, allowed to make mistakes, allowed to try, allowed to fall and get up without judgment, Vincent lived in a different orbit, where every mistake became heavier, where every step had to be calculated, where he had no space to be a true teenager because time did not allow it. There were long training sessions, matches where he had to play as if this was his only chance, evenings returning with fatigue not only in the body but also in the mind, when he wondered if he had done well enough, if he had disappointed those who placed their trust in him or not, and gradually those questions became a familiar voice in his head, replacing the light thoughts a child should have had. His talent continued to develop, and with it came increasing attention from outside, from the media, from scouts, from those always looking for the next star. And Vincent, though not speaking it, understood that he was stepping onto a path of no return, a path where every step forward brought more responsibility, more expectations, and less space for himself. He was not playing just for himself, but also for his family, for the father who had sacrificed so much, for those from the same background as him, for all who saw in him a representative, proof that it was possible to overcome the limits society imposed. And precisely in that period, something began to form more clearly than ever. Vincent was no longer living a single life, but began to exist in two parallel roles, one on the pitch where he was strong, confident, in control of everything, and one outside where he still carried doubts, pressures, emotions that could not be expressed. Those two people were not opposed, but never fully merged into one, because to maintain the image everyone trusted, he had to learn to hide the rest, the weaker part, the unfinished part, the part still trying to keep up with everything happening too fast. No one really asked if he was tired, because when someone showed strength for too long, others would assume it was their nature. And Vincent also gave no one the chance to ask, because he was used to carrying everything himself, handling it himself, continuing without stopping. And so, as his talent became increasingly recognized, as his name began to be mentioned with greater expectations, as the road ahead opened with many opportunities, it was also the time when his youth quietly closed, without a clear moment to say it had ended, only a feeling that he had gone too far to go back to being a child, and from then on, his life was no longer defined by age, but by responsibility, by endurance, and by a silent determination that he would not allow himself to fail, even if the price was giving up the most normal parts of life that he had never truly had the chance to experience. Then one day, when the door to leave RSC, Anderlecht opened, Vincent stepped into a bigger, harsher world where there were no familiar faces, no feeling of being protected by the old environment. When he joined Hamburger SV and began an international journey that many believed would take him to new heights, it was a step any young player would dream of, a milestone confirming that his talent had surpassed domestic limits. But for Vincent, it did not bring relief but a heavier feeling, as if he had just stepped onto a stage where every mistake would be magnified, where every eye was waiting to see if he truly deserved the expectations. The first days in Germany were not like what he had experienced before. The pace was faster, the physical demands higher, the competitive environment fiercer. And while he tried to adapt, tried to prove he belonged there, his body, for the first time, began to no longer be an absolute ally as before. Pains appeared. At first, just fleeting, just small signals he tried to ignore, because he had no habit of stopping, no choice to stop, but then they became clearer, more persistent, forcing him to face something he had not truly thought about before, that there were things beyond his control. When the first injury forced him off the pitch, it was not just missing a few matches, but the first time in his career he was forced to stand aside and watch others do what he had always seen as an indispensable part of life. And in those days, when the noise of the stadium disappeared and the familiar rhythm of matches was gone, Vincent had to face himself in a way he had never experienced. He realized that the body he had always trusted absolutely could now become an unstable factor, something that could betray him at any time, and that feeling of losing control was not only physical but spread to the mind, making him begin to ask questions he had never allowed himself to think about before. Meanwhile, the surrounding environment did not stop to wait for him to adapt. The media began to raise questions, not loudly, but enough for him to feel, comments about form, about suitability, about whether he truly reached the level expected. And for someone who always lived under the pressure of not being allowed to fail, those doubts were not just opinions, but sounds echoing in his head, repeating every time he stepped onto the pitch, every time he touched the ball, every time he wondered if he was going in the right direction. Vincent did not react with words. He did not try to explain or defend himself against outside judgments, because that was not how he was formed. Instead, he tried harder, trained more, pushed himself beyond limits, as if by doing so he could prove it was all temporary, that he still controlled everything. But the more he tried, the more he realized some things could not be solved by willpower alone. There were days he stepped onto the pitch without complete certainty about his body. There were moments he had to adjust the way he moved, the way he challenged, not for tactical reasons, but because something inside no longer worked as before. And for someone who always relied on stability to build himself, that felt like losing the foundation he had stood on for so many years. Anxiety began to creep in, not in the form of panic, but as a lingering feeling that the future was no longer as certain as before, that the path he had taken might not lead where he imagined, and in the rare moments when no one was around, when he did not need to maintain the image of a strong player, Vincent faced deeper questions about his own value, about whether he was truly good enough or just an unfinished talent whose limits were gradually being exposed. It was the first time he felt the gap between the person the world saw and the person he felt inside become so clear, and also the first time his second life was no longer a vague concept but became a reality, a part of life he could not separate. But even so, he still continued. Not because things had become easier, but because he did not know any other way, because from very early he had learned that stopping was not an option, that even when things were no longer under control, he still had to move forward, and precisely in that continuation, amid the pains, the doubts, and the unanswered questions, Vincent Kompany began to understand that his journey would not be a straight line upward, but a series of falls that not everyone saw, times of getting up without applause, and a silent battle to hold on to himself in a world that never stopped demanding more. Leaving Germany with wounds that had not yet fully healed, Vincent Kompany stepped into a new chapter at Manchester City in 2008, right at the time when this club was facing an unprecedented transformation, where new resources, big ambitions, and enormous expectations began to converge. It was not just a contract but a promise, a belief that he would become part of the foundation of the future, and Vincent, as he always did not step in with fanfare, but with quiet focus, carrying everything he had learned from the previous years, both successes and unseen cracks. From the very first matches, he began shaping his image as a centre-back the team could rely on, not only for defensive ability, but for the way he read the game, kept the rhythm, and existed as a stable pillar amid constant changes around him. As Manchester City began attracting big players, as the squad became stronger and more complex, Vincent became even more important, because in a collective seeking identity, he was one of the few who brought a sense of certainty, someone who did not need to say too much but still made everyone clearly understand his role. However, along with the team's growth came the relentless increase in pressure, not only from inside, but from outside, from fans expecting a new era, from media following every move, from the board investing to turn the club into a real powerhouse. And in all that pressure, Vincent was not just a player, but gradually became a symbol, someone all eyes turned to when things did not go as expected. That brought him recognition, but at the same time placed on his shoulders a burden no one really saw. While the outside world saw a more and more complete centre-back, someone approaching the top level, inside, Vincent was still facing the limits of his own body. Problems that had never truly disappeared since his time in Hamburg, small signals, but enough to remind him that everything was not completely under control. There were matches he had to play when his body was not at its best, training sessions where he had to adjust to avoid pains returning, but he did not allow that to affect how he performed, because with the role he was building, showing uncertainty was not an option. Continuity became a mandatory requirement, not only from the team but from himself, as he set the standard that he must always be present, always ready, always the one the team could trust. And that precisely made him push himself further beyond natural limits, playing through pains, ignoring warning signals, continuing when he should have stopped, not because he did not recognize the risk, but because he did not want to become a weakness in a collective trying to rise. Gradually, signs of fatigue began to appear, not in a way everyone could clearly see, but in small moments, reactions a beat, slower, heavy feelings after each match, mornings when the body no longer recovered as quickly as before. And for someone who always controlled everything, those changes were not just physical issues, but a reminder that the journey ahead would not be as simple as what people saw. Vincent continued building his image, continued becoming one of the top centre-backs in the league, continued receiving recognition from teammates and fans. But parallel to that, the double life he had grown accustomed to from before began to become clearer. One person on the pitch with near absolute certainty, and one person outside who constantly had to balance maintaining that image and facing increasingly clear limits. He did not talk about it, did not seek sympathy, did not share the difficulties he was going through because he was used to keeping everything inside, used to letting the world see the strongest version of himself, even if that meant hiding the rest. And precisely in the period when his career was rising, when Manchester City began laying the first bricks for an era of success, when Vincent Kompany gradually became an irreplaceable name, it was also the time when cracks began to form more clearly. Not on the outside where everything was still developing, but inside, where his body and mind were working harder than ever to keep everything from collapsing. And that created a paradox few noticed, that sometimes the path to the peak is not only built with victories, but also with things others never see, silent sacrifices, limits pushed further each day, and a perseverance, not because things were easy, but because he did not allow himself to stop. As Manchester City gradually found the shape of a big team, Vincent Kompany not only developed with that collective, but also became the pillar around which everything revolved. And the moment he was given the captain's armband was not just a symbolic ceremony, but the recognition that in a collective full of strong personalities, expensive stars, and enormous expectations, there was one person everyone could rely on when things started to go off track. From that point, Vincent was no longer playing just for himself, but every run, every action, every decision carried the responsibility of an entire collective, something he accepted not because it was easy, but because he did not know how to refuse. In the locker room, where the spotlight did not reach, where true emotions sometimes showed most clearly, he became the spiritual center, not through loud words, but through his stable presence, through the way he listened, observed, and intervened at the right time, through the way he kept different personalities from colliding to the point of breaking the fragile balance of the team. There were days of victory that made everything lighter, but also days of defeat that brought heavy silence. And in those moments, Vincent was always the one who stood up first, not to blame, but to take responsibility, to keep the scattered pieces from drifting further apart. When Pep Guardiola arrived, a new philosophy was brought in, a style of play requiring near absolute precision, mutual understanding down to every detail. And in that system, Vincent was not just a center-back, but also the bridge between the coach's ideas and how they were executed on the pitch. The one who had to understand first, sense first, and pass it on to others to ensure everything operated as one unified whole. He stood in the middle, not fully belonging to either side, but having to understand both, to transform tactical requirements into concrete actions, to adjust, correct mistakes, and sometimes carry the parts others had not yet perfected. But while his role grew larger, his body did not develop in the same direction. Old problems did not disappear, but only temporarily subsided, and each time he stepped onto the pitch, he carried not only the responsibility of captain, but also the uncertainty about himself. A contradiction he never spoke of, because, to maintain the image of a leader, he had to appear as if everything was under control. There were matches he had to play. Through pain, times he knew he was not at his best, but still did not withdraw, because his presence was not only a professional matter, but also a signal to the whole team that they still had a pillar. Gradually, that burden exceeded the limits a body could naturally endure. But Vincent did not adjust by reducing the load. Instead, he continued adapting by enduring more, by accepting that comfort was no longer the standard, that playing in an imperfect state had become normal. And precisely in that process, he learned to hide, not only from others, but from himself. When he convinced himself that everything was still okay, that he still had control, that he was still the one the team needed. Even when inside the warning signs grew clearer, pressure came not only from matches, but also from the expectation to always be stable, always the best version of himself, a standard he set for himself and what everyone around gradually took for granted, that Vincent Kompany would always be there, always certain, always reliable, and that very trust, though a great source of motivation, also became a burden he could not put down. Because when people got used to you never failing, even a small mistake became bigger than normal, and for Vincent, a mistake was not just a moment in a match, but a lingering feeling. Something he carried longer than anyone realized. He did not allow himself to show hesitation, did not allow himself to slow down, did not allow himself to show that there were times he was also uncertain, because the role he held had no space for those things. And so his double life continued to exist, not as a choice, but as something inevitable. One side, the captain, everyone saw. One side, the man who was constantly adjusting, constantly enduring, constantly juring to keep everything from going beyond control. From the outside, all this might look like growth, like strength of character, like the sign of a great player. But for Vincent, it was a process with no clear stopping point, where each day demanded more than the previous, where each time he crossed the limit made that limit even farther, and where he was no longer sure if he was moving forward or just trying not to fall behind. And precisely in this period, when he was closer to the peak than ever, it was also the time when the price of being the strongest began to appear clearly, not in the form of a big event, but in the form of constant pressure, accumulated fatigue, and a question he never spoke, that if one day he was no longer strong enough to hold everything together, what would happen to the things he had spent his whole life building? Then came a period when even resilience was no longer enough to hide what was happening. When, from around 2013 to 2016, Vincent Kompany's body began to enter a cycle of repeated injuries, like an endless circle, and this time it was no longer fleeting pains or small signs he could ignore as before, but prolonged interruptions, increasingly large gaps between appearances, causing the familiar rhythm of the career he had built to gradually break in a way he could not control. Each time he returned, it was not just physical recovery, but an effort to affirm that he was still there, still the one the team needed, still worthy of the captain's armband. And in the first matches after returning, he often played with compressed energy, as if wanting to make up for all the lost days, as if wanting to prove it was all temporary, that he could still continue as before. But then, before he could regain stability, his body once again stopped, without warning, without negotiation, simply refusing to continue, and he had to leave the pitch again, not in noise, but in familiar silence, a silence that only those who had been through it could understand, when you know you had done everything possible. But it was still not enough. That cycle repeated, returning, then leaving, hope, then disappointment, each time not only taking away time, but also taking away a part of belief, not others' belief, but his own belief in his body. There was something especially painful about realizing that the thing you had always relied on, the thing you had trained, cared for, and trusted absolutely, had now become unpredictable, a variable you could not control. And for Vincent, that feeling was like being betrayed from within, not by someone else, but by himself. He could not argue with his body, could not convince it to continue, could not force it to do what it no longer had the ability to do. And that put him in a state he had never experienced before, when his will was still intact, but the means to carry it out were no longer reliable. In the times away from the pitch, when the noise of matches disappeared and only waiting remained, Vincent had to face thoughts he had always kept at a safe distance. Questions about his role, about his place in the team, about whether he was still the one Manchester City needed or just holding a position someone else could do better. That fear was not spoken, not shared, but it was present in every decision, in the way he trained, in the way he prepared for each return, when he was not only fighting to recover, but also to keep a part of himself in the collective that kept moving forward. Meanwhile, the outside world did not stop. Football did not wait for anyone. and others continued playing, continued developing, continued affirming themselves, and Vincent, though still captain, still a respected name, began to feel the gap between being recognized and actually being present on the pitch. There were matches he could only watch from outside, moments where he had always been at the center before. Now he stood on the sidelines, and for someone who had always defined himself through his role, that was not just a change in position, but a challenge to his very identity. Doubts from the experts gradually appeared, not always directly, but enough for him to notice. Questions about durability, about the ability to maintain form, about whether he was still at the highest level or not. And those questions, though raised from outside, echoed most clearly inside him, where each injury was not only a physical problem, but also a reminder that the path he was on was no longer as certain as before. Vincent did not react by speaking out. He did not try to defend himself against those assessments because he was used to letting actions answer. But in this period, when actions were interrupted, when he could not play enough to prove himself, his silence became a void that others could fill with speculation. Even so, he still continued, not because things became easier, but because he did not know any other way. He continued returning to the training ground, continued recovery sessions, continued preparing for the next return, as if it would be the last time he had to do this, and each time, like that, he put everything he had into it, holding nothing back, not calculating, only focusing on returning, even though deep inside he knew there was no guarantee this time would be different, and precisely in that repetition, between hope and disappointment, between will and limits, Vincent Kompany was not only facing injuries, but also facing a greater challenge, the challenge of holding firm to belief in himself in a period when everything around constantly raised questions, and when looking back, perhaps what made this period the hardest was not the number of times he had to leave the pitch, but the fact that each return he had to convince himself that this fight was still worth continuing, even when the outcome was no longer completely in his hands. But it was precisely during the periods when his presence on the pitch was no longer certain that Vincent Kompany had to face another challenge, quieter, yet no less heavy, as he continued to hold the role of Manchester City captain despite being unable to play regularly, and that meant he could no longer lead through tackles, duels, or decisive moments on the field, but instead had to find another way to keep the team from losing direction, a way that few could see yet demanded more than any action under the lights. In the locker room, he remained the person everyone looked to when stability was needed, the one who spoke when necessary, the one who kept the atmosphere from drifting off course, even when he was no longer in a position to directly determine match outcomes. There were team meetings where he spoke less, but every word was carefully considered, because he understood that in a period when he could not contribute on the field, the way he showed up off it became more important than ever. He listened more, observed more, noticed subtle changes in his teammates' mentality, signs of lost confidence, distances beginning to form, and tried to intervene in the most appropriate way, without imposing, without drawing attention, simply keeping things from falling apart. But to do that, he had to place himself in a difficult position, where he had to separate himself from personal feelings to focus on the collective, where he had to set aside what he was going through to become a support for others. And that was not always easy, because there were days he walked into the locker room with a body not fully recovered, with a mind still haunted by the most recent injury. Yet he still had to keep a calm face, still had to show that everything was fine, that he was in control, that the team could still rely on him. Personal struggles did not disappear, they were simply hidden, set aside as if they did not exist, because Vincent understood that sharing them did not always bring solutions. And in his role, he felt his responsibility was not to seek sympathy, but to ensure those around him were not affected by what he was enduring. He did not speak about lingering pain, did not talk about the anxiety when his body showed unusual signs, did not talk about nights when he was unsure he could return at the same level, but simply kept showing up, kept doing what needed to be done, as if none of it existed. On the bench, in matches he could not play, Vincent followed every moment with the same focus as when he was on the field, sometimes standing, speaking with teammates, offering brief reminders, small adjustments, as if he were still part of the game even without direct involvement. There were moments when he wanted to be on the pitch more than anyone, to intervene, to fix things, to take responsibility for others, but reality did not allow it, and he had to learn to accept his new role, one less visible, but no less important. However, constantly keeping things stable externally did not reduce the exhaustion within. Sometimes it made it clearer, because when you spend too much energy maintaining an image, ensuring others do not see what you are going through, you begin to realize there is less and less left for yourself. There were days Vincent felt tired, not just physically, but from having to always maintain control, balance, a level of stability he knew he did not always truly have. Yet he continued, not because he did not feel the fatigue, but because he was used to placing responsibility above personal feeling, used to continuing even without the same energy as before. And that created a paradox, where the strongest person in everyone's eyes was the one who had to work the hardest to maintain that strength. He did not try to reduce the burden, did not try to share it, but adjusted himself to carry it further, one more day, one more match, one more phase, as if stopping was never an option. And through all of that, his double life did not just persist, but became clearer than ever. One side the captain, everyone saw, always stable, always in control, always reliable, and the other a man gradually exhausted, trying to keep everything from collapsing, not because he did not feel his limits, but because he did not allow himself to accept them. And perhaps what made this period most difficult was not that he could not play, but that he still had to lead, still had to be the anchor, still had to keep everything steady, even as he himself struggled to stay steady. Then, as the season entered its final rounds, when everything was compressed with no room left to step back, Vincent Kompany appeared once more, not loudly, not announced by big statements, but simply present, as he had always been throughout his career, yet this time that presence carried a different meaning, deeper, heavier, because after all the absences, all the cycles of return and departure, all the doubts and pressures accumulated over the years, standing on the pitch at Muz, standing on the pitch at a Mika stage was no longer a given, but something to be reclaimed, piece by piece, through training sessions, unseen efforts, moments when even he was unsure he could overcome. Manchester City was then in a tense title race, where every match was decisive, where every mistake could cost an entire season. And in that context, Vincent was not just a tactical option, but a symbol of stability the team could hold on to. A reminder that no matter how fragile things became, there was still an anchor not swept away. Yet behind that image, he entered the match with everything he had. Not because he was in perfect condition, but because he understood moments like this did not come often. And if there was ever a time to step up, it was now. The match against Leicester City was not special from the beginning. It was like many others in a long race, with tension, deadlock, missed chances, and a sense that time was moving faster than usual. But within those seemingly ordinary moments, decisions were made that later became milestones. And one of them came when Vincent received the ball in a position where, logically, he did not need to take risks, did not need to move forward, did not need to do anything beyond staying safe. There was a very brief moment, almost imperceptible, when he considered, when all the years, the injuries, the doubts, the efforts to return seemed to converge into a single decision. And then he stepped up and struck from outside the box, an action not of a centre-back seeking safety, but of a man unwilling to disappear, unwilling to let his story end in silence. When the ball left his foot, there was a brief pause, but long enough to contain everything he had been through, and when it hit the net, it was not just a goal, but something released, not only for the team, but for himself. A release of pressures built over years, of unanswered questions, of times he had wondered whether he still belonged. That moment was not loud like ordinary goals, but carried the weight of something lifted, a confirmation that he was still here, still capable of making a difference, still someone the team could rely on. His reaction was not excessive celebration, but something more restrained, as if he understood its meaning went far beyond a single moment, that it was not just for that match, but for the entire journey that brought him there. Teammates ran to him, fans erupted, the stadium roared. Yet within all that noise, there was a quieter recognition, an understanding that what he had done was not just the shot, but that he had not disappeared, had not let injuries, doubts, or limitations define his ending. From the outside, it was a beautiful goal, a symbolic moment in the title race. But for those who had followed his journey, it was an answer, not in words, but in action, that everything he had endured was not meaningless, that the years of battling his own body, pressure, and silence led to a moment where he could stand and say, without words, that he was still here. After the match, recognition came from many sides, from fans, teammates, even those who had doubted him. But Vincent did not change how he viewed himself, because for him that moment did not erase what came before, did not make the journey easier, but was simply part of a longer story he still had to write. Yet it cannot be denied that in that moment something changed, not in how the world saw him, but in how he saw himself, when after all the times he seemed about to be left behind, he chose not to disappear, chose to step up, chose to take the risk, and proved that even when things are no longer perfect, a person can still create something meaningful, not because they no longer feel fear, but because they decide not to let that fear define them. After all the roaring of the stadium, the praise, and the moments when the whole world looked at him, there was a place Vincent Kompany could enter without carrying any titles, without maintaining the image of a captain, without having to prove anything, and that was his home, where his wife and children were, where what mattered most was not how he played, but how he showed up as a husband and a father. In that space, football did not completely disappear, but it was no longer central, no longer the thing defining every action, every thought, but just a part of life, set aside to make room for simpler things, meals, conversations, moments where he could sit without thinking about the next match or the pressure of expectations ahead. His family life was not loud or showy, rarely in headlines, yet that quiet became the anchor he could return to after each intense period, a place where he did not have to play a role, did not have to hide how he felt, though even there, the habit of holding things in did not completely disappear. Because when someone has kept everything inside for so long, letting go does not happen instantly. Still, family remained the only place where he could slow his breathing, where life's pace was not dictated by fixtures, where failures were not analyzed and successes did not need repeating. As a husband, he was no longer leading a group, but sharing, listening, learning to exist in a relationship where strength was not control but balance, understanding there were times he did not need to be strong, only present. With his children, he was not a Manchester City symbol, not a captain of a major team, but simply a father they saw every day, not through broadcast moments, but through small things, bedtime stories, playtime, moments where football did not exist. And in those moments he found a part of himself he never experienced as a child, a normalcy he once lacked, a sense of belonging without needing to prove anything. Yet separating these two worlds was not always perfect, because pressure from the pitch could not be completely left outside the door. There were days he brought fatigue home, unresolved thoughts, questions about his body, form, role, and though he tried not to let them affect his family, they still existed as an undercurrent he had to learn to live with. The balance between career and personal life was not a fixed state, but a continuous adjustment, as he tried to give enough time to family without feeling he was missing something in his career, and vice versa, trying to give everything to the team without losing moments he could never get back. Still, despite those difficulties, family remained the only place where pressure could ease. Not disappear entirely, but enough for him to feel the difference, to remember he was not just a player, not just a captain, but a person with other roles, other values. And perhaps that was what kept him going, gave him a reason to return after every fall. Because beyond the pitch, he was not just protecting his place in a team, but building a life he wanted to preserve, a life where he did not always have to be strong, where letting go was not failure but part of existing. Through everything he went through, injuries, pressure, moments of uncertainty, family became the one place where he could set down part of the burden, not to escape, but to continue carrying it further. And in that quiet, among simple things unseen by the outside world, Vincent Kompany found another kind of strength. Not the strength to fight, but the strength to keep living, to keep balancing the two lives he carried for years, and to keep the human part within from being completely overshadowed by the role he had held for so long. And then, leaving that quiet family space to return to football at another level, Vincent Kompany entered a completely different kind of pressure when wearing the Belgium national team jersey, where he represented not just a club, but a nation, a generation called the Golden Generation, names any team would fear. Individuals at the peak of their careers forming a group believed capable of making history. In that context, Vincent was not just a center-back or experienced player, but a leader, a connector, the one keeping all that talent functioning as a unit. A role familiar at club level but carrying a heavier weight here, because what he did affected not just a season, but a country's hopes. In the national team locker room, filled with strong personalities and stars from different environments, Vincent again had to be the balance. Understand each person, find ways to align them toward a common goal, ensure differences did not become barriers, and all of this had to happen quickly, as international football did not allow long-term patience like club football. He spoke, listened, adjusted, not through grand speeches but timely reminders, through his presence on the pitch, something teammates could rely on when things became tense. But with talent came expectation, and for this generation, it was not just about playing well, but winning titles, turning potential into results, proving they were not just good players but a great team. Every major tournament was an opportunity but also pressure, with all eyes on them. Each match analyzed tactically and questioned on whether it was finally their moment. Vincent entered those tournaments with experience and calm built over years, but also carried everything he had been through. Injuries, comebacks, limits he had learned to live with, and in an environment of intensity where every mistake could be decisive, he had to balance giving everything and keeping his body stable enough to last. Sometimes he played with everything he had. Sometimes he pushed through uncertainty, not ignoring risk, but understanding his role did not allow him to step aside. The results were significant, important wins, deep runs, especially third place at the 2018 World Cup, a historic milestone for Belgium, something few expected before, and in those moments Vincent was indispensable, not just for what he did on the pitch, but how he kept the team from losing direction in difficult times. Yet alongside success was a sense of incompleteness, because for a golden generation, the standard was not just going far, but reaching the top, winning the title they were believed to deserve. Pressure from fans and the nation did not fade, but persisted, sometimes as expectation, sometimes disappointment, and Vincent had to face both, ensuring the team was not swept away by external emotions. that their play was not affected by surrounding narratives. He did not avoid responsibility or make excuses, but accepted that some things were uncontrollable, that football did not always reflect potential, that some journeys did not end as hoped, yet that did not lessen the weight of expectations on his shoulders, because every time he stepped onto the pitch for his country, he knew he played not just for himself, but for everyone watching, for hopes placed upon him, for stories people wanted to see fulfilled. And when those endings did not come, when the journeys stopped short, Vincent carried that feeling, not as simple failure, but as part of the path he had chosen, part of the responsibility he had accepted long ago. Thus, between club and country, between roles demanding absolute stability, Vincent Kompany continued living in a fragile balance, leading, enduring, keeping things from chaos, even when results did not reflect effort. And in all of that, the burden of a golden generation lay not only in what they achieved, but in what they could not, what they came close to but never reached. And for Vincent, that was an inseparable part of the journey, something he could not change but had to carry, as he did with every other pressure in his life. Then came a moment when even those used to seeing him always there had to accept an unavoidable truth, as Vincent Kompany decided to leave his playing career, not in a sudden instant, but after a long process where body, time, and circumstance gradually led him to a point where continuing was no longer reasonable. It was not an easy decision, because football was not just a profession, but most of his life, where he found purpose, defined himself, and leaving meant letting go of a part of who he had built over years, something impossible to fully prepare for. When matches ended, when schedules no longer dictated every day, his life changed in ways others might not immediately notice, but were clear to him in every detail. No more early morning training, no more long tactical meetings, no more stepping onto the pitch with absolute focus. Everything that once repeated daily disappeared, leaving a space nothing could immediately fill. Mornings became quieter, time more open, yet that openness felt unfamiliar, as he was no longer driven by external demands but had to decide what to do with himself. That space was not simple rest, but a silence he had never truly experienced, because throughout his career there was always a goal ahead, a next match, a challenge pushing him forward. But when it all stopped, he faced a question he never had time to consider, that if he was no longer a player, no longer a captain, no longer on the pitch, then who was he? Not a theoretical question, but a real one, when everything that defined him was no longer present. Vincent did not rush for answers or fill the void immediately, but could not ignore it, because that silence made thoughts clearer. Questions he had set aside returned, quietly but persistently, about what came next, whether he could find a new purpose similar to before, or if life after football would be entirely different. Some days he felt relief without playing pressure, without pushing his body to limits. But other days he missed it. The rhythm, the clarity of a life shaped by concrete goals. Family remained, still his anchor, but even there he realized he could not exist only as a husband and father without finding a new path, because the part of him used to leading, bearing responsibility, influencing, was still there and did not disappear when he left the pitch. Thus, finding a new purpose was not replacing football but transforming what he had into another form, another way to live with the same meaning. In that process, Vincent faced himself in ways he never had, without the shield of being a player, without clear roles, only his true self with everything he had been through, strengths, limits, unspoken things. It was not easy, because self-reflection demands honesty not always comfortable, but he did not avoid it, because if there was one thing he learned, it was to face things no matter how difficult. Gradually, in that silence, ideas formed, not instantly clear, but enough to show his journey was not over, that there were other ways to contribute, lead, use what he had accumulated. And though the path ahead was no longer defined by matches or titles, it still existed, waiting, And so, when the game stopped, when the final whistle of his playing career sounded, the silence was not an end, but a necessary pause, a moment to listen to himself, understand who he had become, and prepare for a new chapter where he no longer had to prove himself on the pitch, but still had to continue in another way, with the same resilience he carried throughout life. From that pause, Vincent Kompany did not emerge with absolute certainty, but with a decision filled with more questions than answers. Returning to RSC, Anderlecht as a coach, where he had once been a talented boy and now faced the same space differently. No longer directly involved in every play, no longer solving problems through on-field action, but standing outside, observing, adjusting, responsible for what happened without direct intervention. That transition was not simple, because what he built as a player could not be fully applied to the new role. And he quickly realized experience did not always mean ease. Early days as a coach did not feel familiar, because watching from outside required a different understanding, patience, and acceptance that not everything could be controlled as before. Some decisions did not bring expected results. Some tactics failed, and each time he could not step onto the pitch to fix things, but had to observe, accept, and adjust within his role. External doubt came faster than expected, because in football, especially at Anderlecht, results are everything, and when they did not come immediately, questions arose about his experience, ability, whether a great player could become a good coach. Vincent was no stranger to doubt, but this felt different because he could not answer with actions on the pitch, but had to accept that building takes time, something not everyone is willing to wait for. Mistakes were inevitable, and he did not avoid them, but accepting them as a coach differed from being a player, because each decision affected not just him, but a whole team, players seeking guidance, a club with its own history and expectations. There were nights he reviewed everything, questioning whether he could have done differently, read the game correctly, communicated clearly, facing a new kind of pressure, not execution, but leadership. He realized leadership as a coach was not like wearing the captain's armband, relying on presence and action, but communicating ideas, building trust from distance, accepting others would execute his plans, requiring adjustment not just in skill, but self-perception. He was no longer the center of action, but enabling others to be. A difficult shift for anyone used to direct involvement. The process was gradual. No clear moment of full adaptation, but a series of small adjustments, lessons from each match, training, conversation, where he understood leadership was not only making correct decisions, but creating an environment for others to grow, where mistakes were part of progress and development was not always linear. Vincent learned patience with others and himself. Accepting starting over was not regression but necessary, building again step by step. Even when he felt more vulnerable without the armor of a player, with decisions scrutinized without direct response, he continued, because he had learned not to give up when things did not go as expected. Gradually, amid difficulties, mistakes, and doubt, something formed, not perfection, but deeper understanding of his role. Confidence, not from control, but from accepting. He could not always control, and in that process, Vincent Kompany not only began his coaching career, but a new journey, learning again from the start, not as a player, but as a leader in a completely different way, uncertain, yet full of potential for growth. From those early days at RSC, Anderlecht, under scrutiny where every mistake carried weight, Vincent understood the path ahead would not repeat the past, but require rebuilding from the foundation. And in that process, moving to Burnley FC brought a new opportunity, not certainty, but a clearer challenge, where he could shape a style, philosophy, identity less bound by the past. Burnley was not a glamorous, expectation-heavy club, but that gave him space to experiment, adjust, apply lessons from success and failure, realizing leadership was not control, but enabling development. There, he built a distinct style, combining discipline with flexibility, where players understood the meaning behind actions. And gradually results came, not instantly, but enough to build belief, showing his path was not random. Under him, Burnley played effectively with a clear identity and confidence, and winning the championship title was not just a trophy, but confirmation he was finding his place. More important than results were lessons learned. Understanding building a team mirrored rebuilding oneself, requiring time, patience, accepting mistakes, and belief to continue even when results lagged. He was no longer proving himself match by match, but maintaining the long-term direction, demanding a different strength, not explosive, but enduring. When the opportunity at FC Bayern Munich arrived, it was not just career progress, but a new challenge at a higher level, faster pace, greater pressure, expectations allowing no delay. Vincent entered not as a complete novice, but not fully formed, approaching with caution. Understanding lessons must adapt to new context. Elite players, established standards. Whether at Burnley or Bayern, he was not just building a team, but a new version of himself, no longer defined by playing career, but by leadership, thinking, responding to new challenges. He did not forget the past, but used it as a foundation. Understanding failures were not endpoints, but parts of growth. In that journey, healing was not a single event, but a parallel process. Each coaching step also a step in self-understanding. Each small success reframing past struggles, no longer wounds to hide, but experiences shaping him. Through building something new and gradually healing, Vincent Kompany not only continued his career, but redefined himself. Not just a former player, but someone becoming, step by step, in a journey no longer measured by matches or trophies, but by growth, adaptation, and the ability to move forward even when the path was unclear. Looking back at his entire journey, from quiet streets in Brussels to bright stadiums, from a boy growing up in loss to a man carrying collective responsibility, Vincent Kompany is no longer seen as two separate cells, but as a continuous flow of layered experiences, each phase leaving an indelible mark. His childhood was not a stable, loving foundation, but a prolonged silence where he learned to endure before choosing, shaping how he entered football. Not carefree, but aware he had little room for error, that each step carried more than himself. When talent took him to Anderlecht and beyond, he carried not only ability, but expectations of family, community, those seeing in him a path beyond limits, making pressure internal as much as external, both motivation and burden, setting higher standards for himself. Injuries, leaving the pitch, moments when body failed will, were not just physical challenges, but confrontations with limits, truths that not everything could be controlled, and in those times he had no choice but to continue, not certain of success, but unwilling to stop. At Manchester City, he became a symbol of an era, a captain people trusted, keeping the team steady in difficulty. Yet to maintain that image he carried more than seen, playing through pain, leading while unstable, keeping everything steady even when internally uncertain. With Belgium, he carried another responsibility, leading a generation expected to reach the top, achieving significant success yet facing incompleteness, which he accepted as part of the journey. When his playing career ended, he did not cling to the past, but entered a new chapter understanding everything must be rebuilt. And as a coach from Anderlecht to Burnley to Bayern, he faced new challenges, mistakes, pressures, yet continued with the same approach, not quitting, not avoiding. Accepting development comes with uncertainty. Through it all, the constant was his ability to exist in a changing, demanding environment, maintaining stability not because he did not feel pressure, but because he learned to carry it without letting it break him. Thus, Vincent Kompany's image is not just a successful player, a strong captain, or a developing coach, but a person carrying more than seen, not reducing responsibility but accepting it as part of himself. forming his legacy not only in trophies, but in how he endured, stood firm in difficulty, continued in uncertainty, and did not lose himself across many phases and roles. From the outside, it may seem he lived two lives, one of light, success, certainty, and one of silence, pressure, unspoken struggles, but together they reveal not separation but connection. One person carrying all parts simultaneously, simply continuing. Perhaps what makes his journey special is not what he achieved, but how he existed to achieve it, carrying burdens without stopping, turning potential endings into parts of an ongoing story written day by day in his own way. Looking back, what makes his story painful is not rare failures, but how he silently endured so much while the world saw only a steady captain. From a boy who lost his mother early in Brussels, growing up in silence and emotional absence, to a player facing repeated injuries during 2013 to 2016, constantly returning then leaving the pitch, each time losing not just playing time, but faith in his body, yet never allowing himself to fall because he knew his central role at Manchester City. His decisive goal against Leicester City in 2019 was not just a goal, but a release of years of endurance. The voice of someone refusing to disappear despite body and circumstances pulling him down, made deeper by his need to maintain strength in the locker room, bridging Pep Guardiola and teammates even when exhausted. His story also shows a human side, as only within family could he release pressure and be a normal husband and father, something many in modern society, especially in the United States, can relate to as they carry multiple roles without space for vulnerability. The greatest lesson is not always being strong, but understanding real strength lies in continuing despite imperfection. And in a success-driven society like America, Kompany's story reminds that a person's value lies not only in achievements, but in how they endure unseen phases, maintain responsibility without losing themselves, and most importantly, keep moving forward even when uncertain about the path ahead. If Vincent Kompany's story makes you reflect on the silent pressures people carry, please subscribe and leave a heart as appreciation for those who remain standing, even when exhausted inside. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we will continue exploring lives that seem strong but carry untold stories within.